Good evening. This is Dane Parcel, and this is my submission for Module 16 for EDL 854, the case study titled Missing Booster Club Funds. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background on the case study before analyzing the events of what happened. Mr. Stevens is the principal of a school named George Washington Middle School. And he's basically found himself in the middle of a financial controversy between a parent named Mrs. Bowman. She is a parent volunteer that has been doing ticket sales at athletic events. Mr. Stevens relies on volunteers to complete a lot of his athletic events because he doesn't have any additional administration to help him run the school. So the parents do step forward, which is a great thing. However, in this case, at a basketball game, Mrs. Bowman was running the tickets. And after the ticket sales in the game were complete, Mr. Stevens, upon his counting of the funds, found out that there was a discrepancy of $50. The catch to this case study is that prior to this game, Mrs. Bowman had contacted Mr. Stevens to request some monies from the Booster Club to help pay for her daughter's cheerleading camp that was in New York, and Mr. Stevens denied that request. So that kind of leads us to where we are currently in this case. So some additional known facts as we look at Category 1. George Washington Middle School is a school that serves approximately 450 students. However, the student population and the socioeconomic status of that school are declining. The great thing, though, that even though the numbers are declining, community involvement and parent volunteers are still strong that occur during and after school. The students can participate in athletic events, and as a result, there is a booster club that supports the school. The president of that booster club does request that 4 volunteers, parent volunteers, help at each athletic event to help supervise, 2 at the concessions and 2 at the ticket sales. The principal in this case is Daniel Stevens. He has 4 years of experience, seems to be liked by everyone. He does work well with the PTA and the booster club, and he does not have an assistant principal, which is kind of surprising in this fact and the number of students they have. Some additional facts that may or may not have already been mentioned before is that Mrs. Bowman had set up a meeting with Mr. Stevens to request $798 in booster club funds to help support her daughter's cheerleading trip to New York. Her daughter qualified for all-state cheerleading parade, and the family is not able to fundraise that money at this time, so she was hoping the school would help. Mr. Stevens, though, denied that request, justifying it by saying that the funds should be used for all students and one particular person in one instance is not sufficient enough use for that. So Mrs. Bowman left the meeting unfulfilled of her request. So the next Monday, a basketball game occurred, and Mrs. Bowman was running one of the ticket booths. And as a result of her running the ticket booths, there was another adult that came into play named Mr. Dumas, who was another viewer of the basketball game, for so to say. He did speak with Mr. Stevens during the whole process of him coming into the game, and at that point, Mr. Dumas had talked about how he had just cashed his check from his workplace and had to use a $50 bill. And so Mr. Stevens commented that he didn't mind $50. We would take whatever you had, as long as you came to support. And so at the end of the game, Mr. Stevens collected the monies. Prior to that, it should be noted that Mr. Stevens was very busy during the day, during the evening, so he was not necessarily able to check on the concessions or the ticket sales as he probably would have liked, but he trusted his parents to do the right protocols and procedures for him. After the game, he did receive the funds from both the ticket sales and the concessions. He placed the cash bags into his car to deposit with a security card later. And then when he deposited the funds, he found that the concession stand funds were an inventory matched as the paperwork had showed. But in the ticket sales, there was a $50 discrepancy between the ticket sales and the monies that was found within the cash bag, because in her report, Mrs. Bowman did note that there were 10 tickets that were destroyed because they were torn. So some additional facts that I would like to know as I try to identify the problem in this case, and there are several. Were any teachers or staff members serving as supervisors? Where was the second parent selling tickets that the Booster Club requested? And if that person was present, why did they not sign the written note? Or do we know who handled the $50? Do they know where the $50 may be? Some other need to know facts are, were the written notes acceptable to complete the reports, or are there exact policies to handling the funds? Were the bank bags secured in the car, and why were they put in the car? What's the time frame between placing the bank bags in the car and depositing? What was Mrs. Bowman's demeanor after the meeting where she was denied support by Mr. Stevens? Did Mrs. Bowman get any additional fundraisers discussed with her to help her daughter? Why were the tickets discarded and not set aside for proper disposal? How were funds secured during the ticket sales? Did the car possibly get broken into? And is there surveillance video that covers the ticket sales? So Luke's still looking at category 1 when I identify the problem. I believe it's a combination of things. There's several different layers to this. Mr. Stevens' lack of attention to money collection and accounting because he is swamped by supervision duties. His lack of supervision or help in regards to the lack of supervision on busy events. Did Mrs. Bowman's motive to obtain the money entice her to steal it? And where did the $50 go? Was it a mistake or plain out theft? So my plan of action to figure out this problem, I think Mr. Stevens first needs to reflect on his own behavior and how he handled the money. Did he handle it properly? Could he have done things differently? He does need to consider contacting district level personnel, referring to the board policy on how to proceed. He should examine the video if it's available for him. He should also conduct interviews with the ticket sellers and Mrs. Bowman. He should also contact Mr. Dumas because he did specifically say he paid with a $50 bill and that $50 bill was not there. So although we may not know who handled that, it would be nice if he for sure knew he paid with that. We should decide on the consequences with the support of the district, whether that might be repayment if Mrs. Bowman is found guilty, or removal from selling tickets in the future. We also should evaluate and update the policies on our ticket sales. That may include having written procedures, training the staff, or even having forms that are issued by the school that are exact forms to complete. And I think Mr. Stevens does need to request that he get additional help from his school as well as his district. I think it's important as we continue with the plan of action to not necessarily go forward in this case with an accusation that Mrs. Bowman committed the theft. I think it's important to evaluate the situation and figure out observations, gather the data before anything is decided. So category 3, as we resolve the issues in promoting the success of all students, what is best for students? Well, I think we need to resolve the missing fund issue. We do need to do our best to try to figure out what happened. If that is a success for us, that's great. If it's not a success for us, then we need to figure out what kind of protocols we need to do so that it doesn't happen again. We need to resolve the supervision of events. We do have a duty to protect students and staff, and it's important for us to supervise events with the proper amount of supervision that we need. We need to strengthen the internal controls and the safeguards so that funds are available for all students and goods and services are available for them. We need to do our best to retain the positive relationship with Mrs. Bowman. And so that's why I said do not accuse her of stealing. It is simply an investigative issue. We should also support the efforts to try to fundraise for her daughter outside of the school setting so she can still go. And we should continue to encourage the parental support that is already great at the school. So as I reflected on this case, some of the things that I was thinking was Mrs. Bowman may not be the one to blame. Where was the adult supervision, the additional adults? Why did Mr. Stevens take the money to the car? And what are the correct safeguards put in place? As I was reading, my reflection and my feelings was Mrs. Bowman needs $800, so why would she risk just $50? So that kind of led to some confusion. Why does the school district feel that one administrator is sufficient for 450 students? And I was really frustrated that the funds were just taken in the first place or even misplaced. I valued the parental interactions that occurred at the school, especially because at my current school, that is not the case. And so it is a great thing that this school, having low socioeconomic status of their families, has that support. I also need to value Mrs. Bowman's impact on the middle school with her children being a part of that as well. So some unresolved issues is, did something happen overnight to the money? Where are the discarded tickets and were they damaged? Will this situation affect future happenings at the school? And what can I do to help Lucy? So as I look at category 5, which is my reflection of this whole case study, component 1 was, how does the school leader promote the effective and efficient management of the school or district? As data to support this, Mr. Stevens does create a positive relationship with PTO and Booster Club. He does have some safeguards and procedures for handling the money, as he did seem to have some policy in place for managing the tickets, as Mrs. Bowman did give him what numbers were missing. He also had pre-numbered tickets as well, so he does have some procedures in place. He just needs to evaluate them. And he also needs to consider evaluating the correct use of the funds, which he did so when he asked, or when he denied Mrs. Bowman's initial request to pay for her daughter's trip. Category 2, component 2, how do you as the school leader promote the social learning of every student? Well, the first thing is I would continue to acknowledge the success like Mr. Stevens did. He acknowledged Lucy's celebrating of her cheerleading efforts. So I think that's important. He also supported the students with supervising and going to extracurricular activities. And he also did a great job of working with volunteers to help support them in their efforts, which is something, all three of those are some things that I hope to continue as a building leader myself. And then you have component 3, how do you as a school leader promote student academic learning? Mr. Stevens did this in supporting the fundraising efforts that helped buy the goods and services that helped the learning and success of all stakeholders. He did this by making sure that those goods and services that were purchased benefited all students. And then he did this also with relationships being built with stakeholders. I, again, agree with everything that he did to help promote student academic learning. And I feel like those are things that I can also do in my classroom and my building. This case study did provide me the opportunity to kind of take all of the modules into account, use what I learned, and apply them to a situation that could potentially be something I face as an administrator in the future. I hope that is not the case, but it is great to know how to handle situations when they do arise. Thank you, everybody.